Morning
Good afternoon.
or afternoon to you. How are
How's quarantine week 28?
things? Are well. My coworker been struggling with her this week, leaving things out.
Elaine's not behaving?
Elaine has been a lot of trouble this week. She got called into HR.
Oh, well, I left my coworkers at home because they were being too disruptive.
Oh, were they? Yeah. Well, and you got one sick little coworker, don't you?
I have a sick little coworker. We've managed to make it this far without anybody having any trouble, and we're headed up to the doctor this afternoon.
I like your background there. It looks very professional behind you. I've been watching some Zoom tutorials on how to make your space look more professional.
Well, mine is very family friendly. Claire has a bunch of artwork in the background and lots of pictures.
I do see that. And that's fine. I mean, I am not practicing any of it today. I was going to be outside like I normally am, but I had to come in because of rain. So I'm not practicing.
Well, that's a good thing for you to be able to remember your baptism.
Exactly. In fact, I think I preached about that I think I did it in the morning devotion yesterday.
Well, maybe you should take a walk in the rain.
It's all running together.
What day is it?
Yeah. Y'all do sprinkle, okay?
Yeah.
Do y'all sprinkle adults?
We do.
You do. Now, I've been to the sprinkling of a baby. How does the sprinkling of an adult work?
We would gather around the font, and the adult would lean forward over the font, and we would use our hands to scoop up water and put it on their forehead, and the water would drip back into the font, and we would scoop the water onto them 3 times.
I know these are stupid questions, and maybe just call them Baptist questions, but is this person like in a coat and tie, and you're scooping water on them, or do they have some sort of robe on? What is it?
Different churches would do different practices. The ones I've been a part of would just have them standing there. They wouldn't be wearing a robe. So they're just leaning forward, like think if you were kind of rinsing your face over a sink in the restroom. That kind of.
So you might get a little water on your collar or something, but probably wouldn't ruin your tie or anything like that. You wouldn't wear.
We have a baptismal cloth usually that we would give to a baby and their family, but we would let the adult hold to where when they stood up and the water was coming down their face, they could just pat their face off.
Okay. Now, I guess getting used to us baptizing by immersion has been traumatic.
The hot tub is pretty appealing now that we're social distancing. The sanctuary is empty, so the hot tub's available.
The hot tub is available, as you say. That's right. Now, when you go to divinity school, do you have a class in how to do sprinkling and how to perform that baptism?
We have a worship liturgy class that's all parts of worship, and we talk about the different rites and rituals included in a service, from baptism to communion to regular worship. So we would review a lot of those things in that practicum, but it's not specifically focused on baptism.
And you talk about it, but you don't actually practice the baptism.
Correct. And we've had this conversation before. This is not was not our plan for Theology Thursday, but the ways that I've come to explain it, especially being here with you guys in the past couple of years, the difference in theological understanding of baptism has been focusing on who is doing the action. When we talk about baptism. So the Lutheran understanding of baptism is focusing on God's action, that is the bestowal of God's grace upon the person. So child, baby, adult, whatever age, that is God's gift being given to that person and God's claim upon the life of that person as God is their parent and the gift of grace and love. And the Baptist understanding, now you can correct me if I'm wrong because I've only been half Baptist for 3 years now.
I wouldn't even call you half Baptist.
But my understanding is that the Baptist understanding theology of baptism focuses on the person participation and proclamation of faith. And so when we talk about why you do it at a certain age, it depends on if you're focusing on God's action that can happen at any time and all times, or if you're focusing on a person's action, at which point they would want to be of an age to understand and participate.
That sounds like a reasonable definition. And by the way, nobody would even consider me a half Baptist. I don't think. I mean, it'd be a stretch. But, in curiosity or full disclosure, when I was in college, we actually had a class where we went over all the different worship elements like y'all did. But we actually, when it came to serving communion, we had to actually participate in a service where we could serve communion. And when it came to a baptism, we actually had to climb in the water and baptize somebody. And I actually remember, it was a classmate. And actually, you wouldn't say that you were baptizing them. That wouldn't be the proper word. You're just doing a simulation of a baptism because they were actually baptized years ago. But I remember one of my classmates, I had to baptize him and he had to baptize me. And since I did him first, I did him very politely, just a little bit under and out. He decided, since I was second and I couldn't have any retribution, that he decided to hold me under as long as the professor would allow him to.
I think that I would probably do the same.
Yeah. I have that effect on people. They just want to strangle me or drown me. So.
Well, and we have a year, part of our seminary, part of my master's program was a year internship, as well as the other 3 years I'm serving in a church on Sundays. And all of those times you're participating in the rites and rituals of the congregation. And so when you say practicing, I practice baptisms with a family in ministry. Well, if it's a child or an adult, we would go into the sanctuary and let them experience it. And part of that's the counseling and the opportunity to talk about what the water means and the symbolism of it. But it also sets up for them to know what to expect. A lot of folks are nervous. Parents are worried about how the baby is going to react to the water, or adults wondering if they're going to get wet and that kind of thing. So we would go through a simulation very similarly.
We have actually mastered the podcast banter. If I've been listening to a lot of podcasts prior to this and a lot during the COVID-19, and one of the things that always bothers me is all of the banter that has nothing to do with exactly the topic. And, you get
halfway through the show before you get to what really matters. Exactly.
And, the only thing that's missing is we need an advertising spot right here for, whoever is bringing to you this podcast.
Today's podcast from Pelham Road Pastors brought to you by...
I don't know. We need to find us a sponsor. Maybe somebody who's listening will say, I'd like to sponsor them. And, we'll just hold up a sign, that says.
We'll hold up a sign that says, sponsor needed.
Okay, last week we were talking about the Bible and inspiration. And we sort of looked, what I would say is we looked back. We looked at how did an author get the idea to write and get it on paper. And we kind of fleshed that out a bit.
We also talked about the inspiration being on the receiver. So there was inspiration that happened as the authors were writing, but there was also inspiration that happens when we engage the scripture. So
that's exactly right.
Both and.
You're reminding me of that. That's correct. And so this week we were going to turn a little bit in another direction about, that's the Bible we don't have anymore. All of those original manuscripts and the original authors, all of that's passed away. We don't have any evidence of those original manuscripts anymore, the autographed copy, so to speak. And so what we're left with is the Bible that we actually go to church with on Sunday mornings. So how did it get from wherever it was to us? And that's a long journey, isn't it?
Well, it's a long journey before it even got written down. So we talked about last week how those stories were passed on from generation to generation before the authors felt inspired to write them down. And now we're kind of taking that step of once they were written, they were distributed, they were sent out into the synagogues, that the Old Testament writings, the New Testament writings were sent out into the churches, and they were utilized as Christian writings long before there was the Bible as a book as we know it. That process is called canonization. The canon is the collection of books that we now know to be in the Bible, what makes up the Bible. If you're thinking of looking at the table of contents, that's what would be the canon of Scripture. But all of those writings were circulated for years.
Yeah. I mean, I guess one of the ways to put it in perspective is to say that America, the Revolutionary War happened in the 1770s. And if you had to write about the Revolutionary War in the real time, it would have been a newspaper article, okay? But if you were writing about the Revolutionary War in 1976, 200 years later, you'd have a lot more perspective, right? Have a lot more perspective on what had happened in 1776. And so just as that happens, also you have in the biblical case, events happen, something happens, and it's a story that's told, retold, told around the campfire, told again, told again, told again, told again. And finally, maybe hundreds of years later, what happens?
Well, those are the stories. The ones that stick around are the ones that give you the account that is what we remember, the perspective and the lesson that we're supposed to keep from it.
That's right. And so they write it down eventually. It took a while to get it written down, but it gets written down somewhere. And so they have this document that means something to them. It's a story that they treasure and hold on to.
Well, and in addition, the books that were circulated in the early church were more than just the books that we know to be in the scriptures now. And I think that sometimes we think when we hear the Bible and we go to the Bible, we assume that all of those scriptures were the only scriptures. And we assume that that's the only religious writings that formed the communities of faith. But this list, this canon, wasn't in the form that we know it until the mid 300s. I mean, it was centuries of being practiced and used and passed around as a book, as different books, before the collection itself came to be what we know it today.
And you're right, there were several different lists. You can look, I'm sure people can Google this, the canonization of Scripture, and you can see that there were different lists created by different people that would include books beyond what we actually have in our New Testament now. And so, but you're right, it didn't come into complete canonization that they said these are the authoritative documents until, somewhere in the late 300s, early 400s.
Well, and it took several church councils. And there, right. I mean, this is going back into church history, which I care not to do, but you go through those church councils and see different people argued for different books to be included. And it's much like today when you think of, how do we come up with this set of books to be included? There were extreme voices on this side and stories that have been written down and passed on that were over here. And there were extreme stories over on this side. And what they found is they had to come to a middle, to a consensus of which stories worked well with each other, which stories seemed to lift up the same message about God and had been passed down for now these 400 years, which ones had lasted that long and wasn't just, okay, well, here's this book that was proposed, came out a year ago, and now somebody wants to include that in the Bible. Well, that hasn't stood the test of teaching and the test of time. That doesn't complement and go with the voices that have been collected in this kind of generally accepted canon.
So I do think that's one thing for everybody to understand and consider, is that it had to have some measure of time had to be on its side. You could be a document that had been written just a couple of years. It had to have some measure of time on its side, which goes with number two. And the number two element, as I understand it, was that they looked for the wideness of the circulation of it. Let's say that you're talking about Mark's gospel, or any gospel for that matter. And if we can only find it at the church at Antioch, if that's the only place where we actually find the document was in the church of Antioch, and they bring it to this council and they say, well, let's include this book, and it comes from the church at Antioch. And one of the questions is, has anybody else read it? And if it was at Antioch, and if it was at Corinth, and if it was in Jerusalem, and if it was in Alexandria, if it had wide, if everybody was reading it, then when you came before the councils, they were more familiar with it. And they said, oh yeah, I've read that gospel. I've read that gospel. And so the wider it had circulation is the second element of being considered as a part of the canon, is it had a lot of people had read it. And so they said, well, this is authoritative.
And it took several editions. There were books that came in and out of that.
Mm-hmm.
And it took several of these councils of the early churches and early church leaders before they could agree upon that. Everybody kind of had their own agenda to push that they were trying to make claims about.
I think that might be surprising to people to realize that in the end, ultimately, it's a group of men. Sorry, there were no ladies at the council, who are weighing all the evidence and making the decision about what the final canonization is. Just a bunch of humans. Now,
well, I think that goes back to what we were saying last week about some of the inspiration is, we believe that God speaks through the scriptures, and we believe that God continues to teach us and tell God's story through the scriptures. But the Bible itself is a human effort. It's a human account of those stories. And so we take that human brokenness that we know of, that there is always a piece of humanity that has an agenda, that has sinfulness, that has a non-perfect, for lack of a better term, but has fallen from that original state. So the inspiration then is in how we translate and interpret everything, recognizing that it was a bunch of humans that put this together, who wrote down the stories. It was a bunch of humans who collected the stories, and then it was a bunch of humans who decided which stories should be even included.
And also everybody needs to understand that there was no malice involved here in this group of people. They want to preserve the best stories. They want to preserve the things that are most reflective of their faith. They're going to do the best they can to hold together what they feel strongly about. I mean, they're not trying to undermine anything. I mentioned this last week a little bit, but you go to the New Testament and there's another story. Like, you got to imagine that St. Paul, even though he's been dead a long time before these councils are together, that his footprint and his signature is everywhere from this early church. And yet there is that story in the book of Acts where he's actually participating in the stoning of Stephen. And you got to imagine that somebody says, because they're a big fan of St. Paul, they say, can't we just kind of leave that story out, because that really makes him look, it just doesn't fare well for him. Can we
What kind of leader would we follow if the person who made the church and planted the church was stoning people?
Right. And then somebody's got to stand up, and this is why I say there's no malice. Somebody stands up and says, well, it did happen. He was there. And that is part of his story. It's part of our story. It's part of the change. So we're going to include it, even if it does put him in a bad light.
Well, and so some of those stories, when you look at them, the goal is to ask, okay, well, why would this have been included? What does this teach us about the life of faith? Was it for endurance, or was it to show that church leaders are broken too, and that church leaders do things wrong? When we approach those stories that are like, well, why would they shine this light on things, and make us kind of question it? I think it's even more important to lean into those and say, hey, well, yeah, why did they?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Well, that's when you really need to start listening closely, because you wouldn't leave an embarrassing story in unless it really told something very important. I mean, even when we tell stories about our own parents, we leave out the most embarrassing ones because we don't want them to look bad. So if we share something that makes them in a bad light, then there is something in there that's so important it's worth telling.
Sure.
Well, Zoom is telling me that our time is nearing a close here.
We must have done too much rambling at the beginning.
I think you did. Absolutely.
Well, I hope that we shared some insight, maybe about baptism, maybe about scripture. And I wrote down a few notes of things that I think we might be able to talk about next time that might be interesting.
Well, you want to give me a preview? You got a
I wrote down about the different sources of the Gospels and the timing of the Gospels,
yeah.
kind of how those came together. And
You
then
think
I
we ought to tell
also,
them, you think we can tell them about Q, the Q source?
yep, some sources and, the order in which they were written.
Yeah.
But then I also wrote down languages and translations and how there's a lot of insight when you start to understand scripture that how limited our English language is.
That's right. In fact, I have a devotion next week that is about that very subject, about how limited understanding English is and not understanding Greek
Mm-hmm.
shades our reading of the Bible.
Sure. Well, I think we've got enough to go on, and I hope that we make some progress and things start opening up, and we might get to see our hairdresser soon.
Yeah, we might need to get a haircut sometime soon.
All right. Well, thanks for hanging in there with us, and we'll see you next week for Theology Thursday.
I know.